Thanks everyone for coming to today's Biogeochemistry Science Friday. Our speaker today is going to be David Lawrence, who's going to talk to us about the Community Terrestrial System Model Parameter Perturbation Experiment. Go ahead, Dave.
Great, yeah, thanks, Forrest, and appreciate this opportunity to talk. Many of you will have heard parts of this before, if not most of it before, but hopefully it'll be new for some of you. And I should really acknowledge that, as you would anticipate, almost none of the work that has been done here has been done by me. Mostly work from Daniel Kennedy and Katie Dagon, and more recently, Linnea Hawkins, and also just conversations and discussions across a working group that we formed called the Parameter Perturbation Experiment Working Group, and involvement with LEAP as well. So thanks to everyone who's contributed to this effort. So the motivation is fairly straightforward. Of course, the growing complexity of the land models, we're all going to be familiar with this, is leading to an increasing number of parameters. The image there on the right is the iconic image of the CLM5 set of processes that are represented in the models. And we actually went through an exercise and tried to figure out all the parameters in the model and came up with a list that's over 200 long. And that doesn't even include crop parameters, doesn't include parameters related to BVOCs and other higher order processes. But just across these sort of core aspects of the model, we have over 200 parameters. And of course, 20 or so of those, or maybe even more, 30 or so are PFT parameters. And so they have an excess of 15 as well. So it's actually, it's like 500 parameters that are included in the model. So that's a huge number of parameters, and trying to understand the impact of those parameters is a massive challenge. And also calibrating is a massive challenge. So historically, we've taken parameter values from the literature, or made guesses really for some of them. And then we go through this exercise of hand tuning the model when we have a model version that's complete. There's lots of drawbacks, obviously. Everyone's going to be aware of this, that of doing that, if you it's painful, it's time consuming. It really doesn't help you understand your model very well. It's difficult to diagnose structural improvements. It makes it really challenging to incorporate new parameterizations, because every time you bring something in, you have to retune in a hand way. It's impractical. There's really an impractical requisite knowledge base. There's nobody who knows the impact of all these parameters in the model at this stage. And it doesn't scale well with increasing complexity. The more complex we get the model, the less possible it is to do any sort of hand tuning. So obviously, we would like to have automated calibration, but automated calibration on the global scale is been a challenge that has essentially not been met yet by the land modeling community, especially for models like biogeochemistry models, which have very long spin-up timescales, and makes it very hard to go through parameter estimation methodologies. And additionally, there's obviously a huge amount of uncertainty in the projections of the carbon system. Everyone here knows this. I'm not going to go belabor it. And we don't have really a sense of how much of that is coming from structural uncertainty, climate forcing uncertainty, and how much is coming from parameter uncertainty. We essentially have no knowledge. Is parameter uncertainty, the main explanatory feature, or is it just one small piece of it? So we believe that obviously systematic parameter calibration will have a big impact. It will enhance the accuracy of our simulations, and it will increase the suitability and accessibility of CTSM and hopefully other land models for actionable science. That's our term we use now here at NCAR to describe the way we're trying to focus the use of our models going forward. And on the right are just some examples of how we're using land models to try to address actionable science priorities. What we're finding within CTSM, especially as we're trying to support CTSM, and for those who don't know, I'm sure everyone is, CTSM is analogous to CLM, is that new users come in and they have a problem they want to tackle in a particular region of the world, or with a particular new model feature, and when they first run the model, 9 times out of 10, maybe 10 times out of 10, the simulation results don't look very good the first time they look at it. And it's very hard for us to advise them on how to come up with a better looking model, even though we know that most likely it's just parameter changes that would be required to come up with a good model. So we need this sort of ability to do systematic parameter calibration. At the same time, everyone here knows there's unprecedented availability of Earth observations. Tons of new satellite information coming online. I'm not going to go through them because you're all totally familiar with this. The amount of information that we have is, has leapt by orders of magnitude over the last 10 years. Satellite information, there's flux towers, there's an increasing number of flux towers, and the Rubisco project is involved in the Ameriflux project. We're doing a lot of work with the Neon project. There's FluxNet, there's Gavin Bromovic's effort to run 250 sites or so for all land models. So there's a huge amount of data availability there as well. And then at the same time, Rubisco has contributed to the increasing availability of integrated metrics packages like ILAM. And I don't need to introduce ILAM to this group. This was for a group that doesn't know about this. But this, is bringing all these data sets together is a huge effort. And that's one of the advantages that we have going into something like this automated calibration world, is that we do not have to do that to pull these data sets together. We can take advantage of the fact that they already exist within the ILAM framework. So the question is, can we then try to overcome these challenges by using machine learning to calibrate land model parameters? And those of you who were around in the CLM5 development probably remember that we did try to do this. We failed miserably. I got a great set of slides that I've shown previously, showing how stressful it was as we went through that process of repeatedly failing on an automatic calibration. We tried to do it in a bit of a haphazard way. But so far we've failed. But I'm sure the answer is yes, right? I mean, people have done this, definitely for tower sites. I'm just highlighting two papers that I went through a quick literature search where people have focused on, at a regional or a tower site level, there does seem to be some indication that you can calibrate these models. That's not surprising. Calibrating models is something that people have been doing for forever. But one thing I'll say is that even with those efforts, each paper looks like they've reinvented the wheel. So they went through the whole scope of identifying important parameters, building infrastructure to run ensembles of simulations, making the parameters accessible, building an emulator optimization. There's not a lot of indication that there's like any sort of unification of processes. So the answer is yes. Katie and some of us did try to do this with the SP version, the satellite phonology version of CLM5. And she did have some success. She was able to show that, if you looked at GPP and ET and tried to optimize on those variables, that you could reduce the global mean error with a relatively limited set of input parameters, which were mostly chosen by some expert judgment and some of a one-at-a-time ensemble. And she shows that, there was some improvement. But at the same time, there was also regionality problems. And you see here on the bottom right there is that, the default CLM had biases that really big in Central Africa. And the optimized version has reduced those biases in Central Africa. But, the problem probably got worse in the Amazon. The biases got worse in the Amazon. So there's some issues that came out of that Katie kind of uncovered within the context of that work. And we're sort of building off of that, some of that work here. So this led us to this Perturbed parameter experiment project, which has a number of phases. And I like to call the first part is phase 0, which is basically infrastructure development. So a few things we needed to do. One is we need to expose all those parameters. So there's these 200 parameters, probably less than half of them were easily manipulatable. They were hard-coded into the model. And so we needed to bring all those out. And there were some decisions that we had to make along the way that I'm not going to get into here. But that was an effort in and of itself, finding all the parameters. Then we had to identify parameter ranges for each one of those. So there's literature surveys, expert judgment. We went through the process for all those 200 parameters, just determining reasonable parameter ranges. And then we also wanted to build long-term maintainable ensemble analysis scripting that allow us to run hundreds to thousands of simulations in one fell swoop, including spin up. And so for BGC, obviously the challenge, the additional challenge is that you need to be able to spin the model up to equilibrium with each parameter change that you do. And that has previously been prohibitively expensive, and I'll get to that in one moment. So one of the activities is defining all the parameters. So we've defined parameter ranges for every single parameter that we've identified, those 200 plus parameters in the model, and put them into an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Sheets spreadsheet, so we can track these going forward. And so for each parameter, we have identified the low side perturbation and the high side perturbation of reasonable values. If it's a PFT level parameter, we have a separate tab on here, which would take you to the high and low values for each plant functional type. And we have notes, and we sort of have been tracking this, and we can adjust these values as we learn more about the system. So this in and of itself is a really useful byproduct of this effort to have, some understanding even of what the parameters all are within the model. And then the second thing is we need the model to go faster. So, because of that long spin-up time scale, it was really impractical. So we combined two different activities to get the speed up that we needed. One was a cluster analysis that Forrest had previously done on a paper in 2013, and we replicated that here, taking advantage of his knowledge there to look at in using information on mean and variability and even trends to identify the most important points around the world that you could use to sort of replicate what's happening in global simulation. And we actually use ILAM, reconfigured ILAM, to tell us, when we essentially had enough grid points to be able to have a reasonable reproduction of the whole world. So that resulted in a sparse grid where we have about 400 grid cells that if you just run those 400 grid cells, you can get most of the main features of the climate system and the transient carbon cycle system. And the second feature that we used was the matrix solution to CN, which allows us to decrease the spin-up time scale by a factor of 10 or more. This is coming out of Yichi Luo's group. And combine these two together, we get greater than 100x speed up, actually closer to 200x speed up in the model, so that we can actually then think about practically running a large number of parameter perturbation experiments. And so with about 1 million core hours, we can run 2,000 experiments. That includes the full 150 years of spin-up that you need, and then 10 to 20 or 30 years of analysis period information. So that kind of got us to the point where we could do this. Then there's phase one. It was a one-at-a-time parameter ensembles and a range of, and that's sort of the obvious thing to do. The thing that we've done, which is a little bit different, is that we've also done it under a range of environmental perturbations. So we ran the one-at-a-time parameter ensembles with high and low values for each parameter for all 200 plus parameters with present day control conditions. And then we repeated those ensembles for several different environmental perturbations. So the climate of 1850, the climate of an SSP37 CSM2 climate in 2080 to 2100, CO2 levels at 1850, CO2 levels at the SSP37 level at 2080 to 2100, and then also nutrient deposition, nitrogen deposition perturbation. And in principle, you could do this for more things, like we've talked about doing, we have not done it yet, but for large glacial maximum conditions, if you wanted to understand the impact of your parameter ranges for simulation of creating that kind of like paleoclimate conditions. And what we can do here then is restrict the parameter ranges. Again, if we know that the low side environmental perturbation, especially the low CO2 or the colder climate, doesn't pass reasonableness check. So if you get a lot of plant death that's happening for a parameter specific parameter value, we can adjust those. And we did that and found, for a handful of parameters, it actually helped us, find a parameter value that would produce a world that wasn't all dead. And so then this is just an example of what you get out of it. This is the top 12 parameters that are, regulating CO2, fertilization, effect on the global vegetation carbon stocks. And so this is just showing the effect of the 2100 CO2 levels, 867 ppm on total vegetation carbon. And you can see this range of parameters. I'm not going to go through the list of what all these parameters are, but you can see that it's a range of different kind of parameters, from hydrology to photosynthesis parameters. So the nice thing about this data set, this one-at-a-time data set, which we think is already proving useful, is that you can explore things like what parameters control soil water at 10 centimeters. And so you can look at, the present day mean climate and what's controlling that. And you see, not surprisingly, it's hydrology parameters or soil texture parameters, but also plant parameters are among the most important in the top 5. You can also ask, what are the parameters that are controlling interannual variability of soil water 10 centimeters with this data set? And we see that it's actually a different set of parameters, some hydrology and some plant parameters. We can also ask the question, what is controlling the CO2 response, the response of soil water to CO2 changes. And actually what I see here is the changes are relatively small, but again, it's a different set of parameters, and not surprisingly, it's the plant parameters, which are the most important. And then again, you can look at the climate change impact. So which parameters are controlling the soil water response to climate? And again, you see it's a different list of parameters. And so with this big database of simulations, we can then explore for any variable, for any perturbation, which parameters are the most important. And as we're probing this data set, we're also looking at we're calling a biome level analysis. And this is, again, going to be completely unsurprising, but it's something you would miss if you did a single site kind of parameter optimization effort. Is that different biomes, the top parameters are changed. So this is the looking at the GPP mean, and you look at the tropical rainforest versus temperate grasslands and desert versus boreal forest. And what you see is that the parameters that are controlling the response to those are different in these different biomes. And that is, again, not surprising, but having this data set around allows us to probe this quickly and easily and see that, it's plant water use in the tropics, it's soil water availability in the temperate regions and the grasslands, and it's light use efficiency in the boreal forest. All of these things totally make sense, but it's nice to get the confirmation and also then just have the ability to, use this data set to probe to understand what and where different parameters matter. And so we're already seeing that this data set is proving really useful. There's been, about 8 to 10 spin-off projects from the Perturbed parameter experiment effort that have already started looking at different ways to use this data set. So there's a spin-off project on land atmosphere interactions. There's a spin-off project on neon site calibration, a spin-off project on ET recession timescales, Arctic river flow, land influence on drought, hydrologic sensitivity, tropical carbon cycle, internal variability, and GPP responses to permafrost thaw. So this is definitely a case of, I think, evidence that if you build it, they will come. And that's pretty encouraging, that if we did get to a full calibration methodology, that we would have, a really large number of potential uses. And I just want to highlight one here, which is the ET recession timescales that is work that has been done by Linnea Hawkins in collaboration with us. And she's one of the leads on the Ameriflex Rubisco collaboration group. And I don't want to steal her thunder here. I think it'd be great for us if we invite Linnea to come and talk about her work here. But just briefly, she is finding that if you look at, identify the parameters that are most important, that are controlling the time scale of the decrease in ET after a rain event, that you can find parameter settings that will actually reproduce the observed tau, and also reproduce the observed ET, which seems to be an important feature to get right in your mean to be able to get your observed tau right. So just some indication that this could, that this is another kind of metric you could use to try to calibrate your model. Okay, so then the next phase is this moving into parameter interactions and trying to calibrate. And so we're starting off with a Latin hypercube ensemble with the most important parameters, and I'll get to how you define those important parameters in a moment, and then developing a neural network to emulate the CLM output with parameters as input work, building off of what Katie has done previously. And this is actually in collaboration with LEAP, which is a new science and technology center sponsored by NSF, to bring machine learning to CSM, to help advance CSM. And actually, Linnea has just started working with us on the LEAP project here at NCAR. So, the first question is parameter selection. What are you calibrating for? Obviously, it much depends on your variable. And when we were first talking about this, I was probably being overly ambitious and saying, we're going to try to calibrate for everything all at once. Let's do it. Just go big. Daniel and Katie talked me, and the rest of the PPE working group talked me off of that cliff. But that's the key thing you have to ask at the beginning. What is a variable or variables that you're going to try to calibrate against? That's obvious. But additionally, you need to know which, and then the parameters that matter are going to differ for which variable. But additionally, I think we'd like to consider more than just mean state. So, obviously you want to get the global mean right, but there's also inter-annual variability globally or at the site level or grid cell level. There's a diurnal cycle. There's biome level mean, which is going to be, give you different sets of parameters. And there's also responsive perturbations, which again, will give you a different set of parameters. So the caveat number one that we learned from Katie's work is, this tropical bias problem, which is that, for a variable like GPP, and of course this spills over into what we've experienced with ILAM, is that, because GPP is so high in the tropics, it tends to dominate whenever you try to do a calibration effort, and you don't actually see much improvement around the rest of the world, even if, an overall goal is to make the model better everywhere. So tropical T is totally dominating that flux. So you need to have methodologies that kind of allow you to not have have a tropical bias. You also want to include parameters that affect both present day climate and also past and future climate. And this is just an example of the TPU acclimation parameter. And I know there's some debate, I think, that's even come out of Rubisco and the FATES community about whether TPU acclimation is a reasonable parameter to include in your model at all. But irrespective, it is in CLM and CTSM. And what we find is that that parameter has a not that big of an impact on the mean state, but a very large impact when you go into the future climate. And any dot along that sort of comes off of the one-to-one line here is a parameter that has a bigger impact in a changed climate than it does in the mean state, or a different impact. Okay, so we have to determine what are the most important parameters by using this broad set of variables, and I don't have the opportunity to talk about everything here, but the other consideration is that you want some parameters that are controlling more than just the mean state. So for a parameter like Jmax B0, which is a global photosynthesis parameter, if you change Jmax B0 to a higher low value, it changes GPP or photosynthesis everywhere. So it's a lever that can control the mean across the whole world, but doesn't really have a regional capability. So the question is, can PFT parameters help? And of course, you would expect that PFT level parameters would be able to help. So if you change the Medland slope for broadleaf evergreen tropical trees, that is only going to change behavior of the model where broadleaf evergreen tropical trees are. So we want to make sure we include, a significant number of PFT level parameters within our sets of parameters to sort of give us regional levers, and also make sure that within our infrastructure, we allow those parameters to be adjusted independently for different PFTs. So we are starting off then, instead of going for all these variables all at once, we have taken something a bit more reasonable and said, we're just going to try to calibrate for a leaf area index. So we've gone through the exercise of trying to identify the most important parameters based on these different controls: global mean, global intertrend variability, biome level mean, responsive perturbations, and come up with this list. And what you see is a nice mixture of photosynthesis parameters, hydrology parameters, plant water use parameters, phenology parameters, leaf physiology parameters, respiration allocation, and nitrogen uptake. So, and actually snow. So it's a good mix of parameters that are kind of hitting at many different aspects of the model, and several of them are PFT level parameters, which does give us some hope that we'll have the ability to calibrate globally, regionally, and across different time scales and across different perturbations. So, if we run a Latin hypercube then with I don't know if this is the correct numbers anymore, but I think we had at one point about 22 parameters. Actually, there's more than 3 PFT level, but 28 effective parameters. These numbers are all a bit outdated here, but it's roughly 500 simulations. You can run what we think is a reasonable Latin hypercube with this number of parameters. And one thing we're doing, which is again something that is maybe not commonly done because most people are not trying to calibrate biogeochemical models, is we are running for the entire historical period. So we're spinning up in 1850 like we normally would, and then running the entire historical period. And this is trying to get around the non-equilibrium problem, that if you bring the model into equilibrium in present day, the LAI values, the GPP values, and other environmental quantities will not actually be will not have a good match to observation. So if you don't do that transient behavior, so the model is responding to the CO2 changes and the climate changes dynamically, then it makes it very hard to compare to observations. So this is just an example. We haven't really done a lot yet here, but here's an example. If you look across that entire Latin hypercube of roughly 450 simulations and just plot the cumulative NBP for each one of those simulations across the historical period, you see what's really interesting is a massive range, right? This is a range that spans basically what you would see in the CMIP ensemble. Now, of course, many of these parameter settings are going to give you unrealistic, land model simulations, but I think it's just an interesting early indication that we can get a very broad range. So then the step then, of course, is to try to refine these. And here it's also just looking at in terms of looking at global means of specific variables and seeing whether it's got some good Gaussian distributions or something more skewed. And we're seeing that for some for some variables that there is a nicely looking Gaussian distribution in terms of the global variable across the parameter ensemble, and then other variables like latent heat flux show like a peak that's sort of skewed towards higher values. Again, just sort of initial probing that Katie has done looking at this. So the next step then is to build a neural network as an emulator of the parameter values, so that we can then use that neural network to predict what the model would simulate as you vary the parameters, and then use that to combine with multi-objective strategies to optimize. And this is where Linea will be stepping in and trying to help us come up with these optimization methods. So in the end, we're hoping to have a calibrate parameter sets for CSM3, one or probably several calibrate parameter sets, and we'll see if we get there. We're trying to finalize CTSM6 somewhere near the summer of next year. So we don't have a ton of time to try to make progress on this, but we're hoping to have at least some calibration going on within CLM6. And then the ultimate goal will be to try to quantify the carbon and water projection uncertainty, like I showed a couple of slides ago, but with constrained parameter sets that give realistic simulations of present day and the historical period, and then do it like a 200-member ensemble of the full global model with a 2-degree resolution to see what the range of predictions might be across that period. So to summarize, with this new infrastructure, we're able to run large ensembles of a global CLM. We've run more than 2,000 simulations to date with a full version of BGC, taking advantage of the sparse grid and CM matrix spin-up. This one-at-a-time ensemble really we're finding providing really valuable insight into model behavior. And we will make that is already available with anyone who wants to use it on Cheyenne, and we'll eventually make it available via LeapPanGeo or other methods. And we're making progress towards open source parameter estimation tools. And many of you are already joining, but the PPE working group meets approximately monthly, and you're welcome to join us. And I'll stop there for this first presentation.